Jai Shri Krishna. So I'm currently reading a book called Grief, Growth, Grace by Neena Verma. She is a grief growth specialist and a positive psychology expert. Although she has been practicing as a grief and growth counselor and coach since 2008, a personal tragedy in 2014 took her understanding and practice to a greater depth when her elder son was lost in an inexplicable cardiac arrest at the unlikely age of 22 years and 3 months. 22 years and 3 months. She published her grief memoir called A Mother's Cry, A Mother's Celebration in 2016. Her recent book, Grief, Growth, Grace, is truly a labor of love. It is both a self-help book for those on grief journeys as well as a practical guide for professionals who work with clients in grief or trauma. In this video, I'm going to be reading a few quotes from the book. So, let's get started. Since I'm reading quotes from the book, it may seem random, but my suggestion is pause and reflect upon the quotes that I'm about to read. So a certain chapter highlights the universality as well as the individuality of grief and explains that the grief journey is slow, chaotic, and unique to each individual. There is nothing to be fought, fixed, or treated. Grief is not a matter of getting over. Instead, grief is to be transcended. That grief is a journey, of course, with phases and aspects. But unlike some popular models, this journey is not stage-bound or sequential. To each their own way of grieving and growing. The book culminates with the soulful part 3 of Marvel of Grace that puts the spotlight on the almost invisible but essential aspect of grace. The humble, gentle, calm, and acceptance human spirit that helps us affirm the dark and inspires us to seek the light. In fact, sometimes grief may have no closure. It comes to stay, and this too is fine, unless it has turned complicated, in which case professional help should be sought. And I go on to reading, as I said, different quotes. If I'm quoting from a known personality, I will be quoting them. Otherwise, it is probably Neena Verma who's saying the words in the book. But if I make a mistake, I ask to be forgiven. So here is a quote from Donald Miller. All the trees are losing their leaves. All the trees are losing their leaves, and not one of them is worried. And that was a quote by Donald Miller. But now I continue with the book. One may experience a similarly vague sense of loss and grief when a loved one is physically present but mentally and psychologically absent, such as in the case of medical conditions like Alzheimer's, dementia, or comatose state. So a person may be physically there, but mentally he is absent, and that is also a loss, isn't it? In recent times, COVID-19 has emerged as a uniquely painful variant of complex bereavement. The dreaded virus is depriving people of parting contact with the deceased and leaving the bereaved in a state of incomprehensible pain over not being able to see, touch, talk to, say a symbolic goodbye, and have some sort of closure with their departed loved one. The guilt over not being able to offer a dignified funeral and perform parting rituals complicates the bereavement even more. And then she talks of a case where a loved one witnessed a progressively degenerative medical condition. And that is when one experiences anticipatory grief, even before the person passes on. And I go on to a quote from Laurel K. Hamilton, who says, "There are wounds that never show on the body that are deeper and more hurtful than anything that bleeds." Now let me read a paragraph from Neena's book. Sometimes a traumatic event may not involve death, yet the severity of the trauma can feel acutely grievous, almost like bereavement. Common examples include devastating natural calamities or accidents that leave people with serious injuries, permanent immobility, or in a non-functioning state, causing lasting trauma. Victims of crimes involving gruesome violence or violation are potentially high-risk cases for prolonged psychological trauma. People affected by such traumatic events sometimes develop post-traumatic stress disorder, that is PTSD, showing symptoms like hyperanxiety, depression, paranoia, intrusive rumination, or such other conditions. And another paragraph. Most people are able to deal with trauma with a fair measure of resilience, dusting off their brokenness, gathering themselves up, and getting on with life. But sometimes people get deeply shattered, develop PTSD, and need clinical help. Their stress and pain notwithstanding, there is enough evidence to suggest that not only do some people emerge stronger, but they actually turn a traumatic event into a stimulus for growth. And now a quote from the Gita. "Death is certain for one who has been born." Srimad Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 27. Japanese writer Haruki Murakami said, "Death is not the opposite of life, but an innate part of it." And here is a paragraph. "Bereavement is the grievous loss that ensues when we lose someone significant to death, someone whom we feel emotionally close and attached to." And the word bereavement evolved from Old English word. It's bereafian, or Middle English bereavin, which meant to rob, deprive, or take away, or tear away, from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And in a symbolic way, loss by death actually feels as if one has been torn apart, robbed, and deprived. However, there is bereavement without trauma, when maybe the death is natural, timely, expected, and under normal circumstances. Though people do take time to adapt and restore, it is free of any trauma manifestations. And then she goes to say, perhaps one of the hardest to talk about is the loss of a child. It is not without reason that such a traumatic loss is called the ultimate bereavement. No parent can ever be strong enough to contemplate the thought of outliving their child. And Neena Verma's quote, "When parents die, they leave behind legacy. When children die, they leave behind shattered dreams, which pierce your whole being like sharp pieces of broken glass." And then another quote by Arthur Golden. "Grief is a most peculiar thing. It is like a window that will simply open of its own accord, but it opens a little less each time, and one day we wonder what has become of it." And Neena Verma says, "Grief, like love, is the song of the soul. Not all songs bring joy, though some are songs of cry. Cry your loss, celebrate your love." And there are different ways that people deal with grief. One with gratitude, another maybe feel let down by doctors, technology. And here William Worden says, each person's grief is like all other people's grief. Each person's grief is like some other people's grief, and each person's grief is like no other people's grief. So each one will grieve in their own way. And in Neena Verma's memoir, she says, sometimes there is a deadening silence and sometimes there is a deafening wail. And that's loss and bereavement are never easy to live with. Grief is essentially a painful experience. That said, if grief is a natural fallout of loss and bereavement, so is the innate human resilience and sense of meaning. So people eventually are resilient. We have been living with death from times immemorial. So I will end probably with this, where she says, perhaps one of the most common misconceptions is that time heals. Well, not quite. Time doesn't heal. We heal over time. And here I would like to just speak about myself. I lost my father when I was 4 years old, and I always missed a father, always. I wouldn't speak much about it, but I would. And finally, I feel that I felt healed when I got married and I saw my husband being such a great father to his children. The other pain I suffered was when I lost my husband, my partner of 49 years. But I could not help, because maybe it's been a habit of mine since I was a child to always focus upon gratitude. So maybe whenever the pain would become unbearable, I would replace it with gratitude for the 49 years that I had had and for the fact that he did not suffer much. So this was only a few pages of the book from where I have quoted. I strongly suggest you read it, because she doesn't only talk about loss in terms of death. She talks about loss of a job, it could be loss of a relationship, it could be loss of finance, and who can say that we don't suffer losses as we live? So think about it. Take care and God bless.